Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. We've all heard of the term tax and spend, but increasingly in the United States, our state and local governments can be more accurately described as spending but not taxing. How does this happen, and what are the consequences of this for our political economy? And is this really an example of small government conservatives? Joining me on EconVersations today to talk about this is Dr. Dan Smith, the Associate Director of the Johnson Center for Political Economy. Dan, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much, Dan. Happy to be with you again.
Well, we're actually going to change it up today, and instead of me asking the questions, you're going to be asking the questions of me, and we'll get into this topic of what I like to call spend no tax, but don't tax politics.
Reversal of fortunes, Dan. Now you're in the hot seat.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is a very fascinating topic. Harry Hopkins, he's an advisor for FDR and also the administrator of the WPA program in the 1930s. He famously was quoted saying that we should spend, tax, and elect. And I think this has been generally shortened to tax and spend politics, and it's prevalent, especially for politicians that consider themselves liberal. Is this a problem that we have in Alabama, or do we have something different?
Well, I was looking at, when I started to look at some of these statistics on spending by our state government, I thought it was very interesting the fact that the state government was claiming to spend about $29 billion in recent year, and yet if you look at our tax revenues, the tax revenues collected by the state, it was only on the order of $9 billion. And this seemed to be a case of, well, they're spending all of this money and yet they're not taxing to collect the money. And so it seemed like a reversal, or at least a modification of the old line of tax and spend. They're certainly spending, but they don't appear to be taxing. And when you look at it, it's not just the state of Alabama. Our local governments are doing it to the same issue. They're spending on the order of around $21 billion and yet collecting less than $6 billion in taxes that they are imposing and collecting in their own governmental units. And not only that, when I saw this in Alabama, I looked at other states, and Alabama's not alone. When you sum across all the different states, and this is in percentage terms and not dollar amounts, well, you can see that across all of the state governments, those states across the U.S. are collecting less than 40% of the money that they're spending, and local governments are around 35%. And our percentages in Alabama come in a little bit less than that. So maybe our problem is a little bit worse in Alabama. We're taxing even less and spending more. But it's a common problem we seem to see across the U.S.
So it's clear that a tax and spend politician is clearly going to be a liberal politician, but a tax but don't spend, or spend but don't tax politician, how do we classify them?
Well, I think that's a good question, and I think depending on the context, there might be some circumstances in which reducing taxes could make sense. And I think maybe the first time we heard about this was back in the early 1980s after Ronald Reagan was elected on a platform to try to reduce the scope of government. I think he wanted to both cut spending and cut taxes. But he ran into a problem that the House of Representatives was controlled by Tip O'Neill and the Democrats, and they simply weren't going to pass spending cuts. And so Reagan and his advisors were left with a problem. Like, we would like to cut back spending and taxes. We can't cut spending, but they had the ability to perhaps push some tax cuts through. Should they push the tax cuts through? And they chose to. They chose to do that, and I think it probably ended up being beneficial for our economy to reduce the tax burden. And the federal government had an ability to borrow, and I think you can also say there's some long-term calculations that if we run up this big deficit, eventually one day it'll be push us to have to cut spending. So there are all kinds of calculations that were involved there at the federal level. Maybe Reagan's approach there made sense in the 1980s for the federal government.
Mm-hmm. So it seems like a paradox, though, because most states and the federal government have expenditure limits, they have debt limits. how is a spend but don't tax politician even possible in this environment?
Yeah, well, yeah, that's a very good point, because I mean, the state of Alabama has to pass a balanced budget every year, and passing a balanced budget last year caused us to have 2 extra special sessions of the state legislature. So how is it that this is happening? Well, if you take a look at, dig into the statistics here, our state and local governments are getting money from a lot of other sources. For the state government, the big sources of their revenues was the federal government. So we have a lot of intergovernmental grants. And for the state of Alabama, those are largely coming from the federal government for a number of different programs like Medicaid and highways and so forth. That the federal government is collecting taxes, and then they send it through grants to the states, and then the states get to allocate or spend some of that money. For our local governments here in Alabama, the state is a big source of that money, and some of that money is actually passing through twice. So it's a federal grant that goes to the state, and then the state passes it off to the local government. But another thing that the state and local governments are also doing is they're counting a lot of money that's being paid by users of of different government services as revenue. So, for instance, in this category of current charges, we see that for instance, college tuition that's paid to, say, Troy University by the students gets counted as part of the revenue that our state government is allocating. I mean, that money's being paid by students directly to Troy University, so it's a bit of a misnomer to say that the state's delegating that money, but at some level you can sort of see that as, and you can see other things for our local governments. Here in the city of Troy, we have water and electricity that's provided by the city government. We pay bills for that every month, and so that's some of the utility revenue there. And then the contributions or the payments made into the state employees pension program is counted as another form of revenue. But again, if you think of that as like a pension plan, the employees are having that money set aside and paid into their pension, and yet it's still counted as sort of state revenue.
Yeah, so essentially to get elected in Alabama, it seems like you have to be a low-tax conservative, essentially. Are these low-tax conservatives running in Alabama, are they actually true champions of a limited government, or are they more of this spend but don't tax variety?
I think there's certainly the big element of spend and don't tax, and I think that that can really be contrasted with limited government, because even if you're a state or local politician in Alabama or other states, you're running and you're in effect somehow trying to claim that you have all this, you're handing out all this government services. You're handing out $29 billion worth of spending, even though you're only taking in $9 billion worth of taxes. So you end up getting your fingers on a lot of money to be able to say it's coming from you. And if you think about it, you're running on the same sort of platform of offering a whole bunch of government services that the larger government liberal tax and spender is doing. In effect, offering is telling to people, we'll offer the same range of government services. We'll offer schools and parks and Medicaid and unemployment compensation and so forth. This whole range of government services. So your basic plea in the election process is to sort of say, vote for me, I'll bring you all these government services and government goods, stuff from the government. So I think that can certainly be contrasted with somebody who believes in a much more limited view of government and say, well, we just don't want government doing this at all.
Yeah, so there's politicians, and I think most politicians realize it, that spending money is fun, that helps you get reelected, but the taxing part isn't as much fun, and that also hurts your chances of getting elected. So there you have this incentive to spend that money but not tax. One way that you can imagine that politicians try to get around this is by taking credit for everything good that happens when they're in office. Al Gore famously claimed to have invented the internet, and you could think of other humorous examples where politicians take credit for things being done by the private sector, and claim to have done it through government provision. Does this have a cost to it, or is this just something humorous that politicians attempt to do?
Well, I think certainly on some margins there is some humor that's involved. But then I think at a more deeper level, I mean, I think there are a number of different problems that arise from that. I think one of the issues that arises is that given the way the financing for a lot of our services that are provided by the state government works out, and we're largely relying on people who are paying these user charges, which in the case of higher education would be tuition. We have a bunch of our services where we have these revenues that are coming from the users, and they're being used to pay for these services, which in general I think is a pretty good idea to have user charges, because you can in effect have the people who are benefiting from government pay for a good part of the share of the cost of government. And so that might make perfect sense. But we also have a potential to have privatization of some of these services. When you already have the beneficiaries of a service paying for the service, then that's already pretty much on the model that you need to have a private sector business operate it. And so we have a lot of things set up on a basis that's similar or could be potentially privatized. And yet, I think that the attempts by politicians to claim credit for providing these things might serve as a barrier or help thwart privatization. A politician, yeah, they can take credit for the sun coming up, but maybe we're all sort of chuckling. We can laugh at Al Gore's claims. There needs to be some plausible. There needs to be some plausible cause and effect here. You need to have your fingerprints on it, and to some extent, to be able to more credibly, without causing laughter, as a politician, claim credit for these things. And I think privatization is one of the areas where a spend but don't tax politician is going to be opposed to privatization, or at least in a way that a limited government politician would more readily embrace.
Does the provision of some of these services that government provides, even despite the fact that they could be provided by the private sector, does that crowd out private sector activity in these areas?
It certainly it really could, because I mean, not only there's many times the government's providing things that the private sector could be providing, but they're providing it at a very low cost. So we have our state parks. We do collect some fees from that, but there are also recreational opportunities offered by the private sector where they'd have to pay the full cost. And so low cost or subsidized government services, and also with hospitals is another example, or I think schools are a really good example of this. When you make public schools available with no tuition charge for a whole bunch of families who have already paid taxes that are, somehow or another, they're paying taxes that have gone to cover some of these expenses, then they're paying these taxes, and yet they still have to then pay out of pocket for the cost of a private school. And so for a lot of families with a modest means, given that they've already paid for the public schools through their taxes and they're now available at a zero price, that's a real distortion. It's hard for private schools or other private providers to compete with this zero price to government competition or low price to government competition. And that can really help disrupt a lot of the market. So we can have a much larger market for governments, for schools, or maybe private universities, or private parks, or private hospitals, if we didn't have the distortion of the prices due to government provision.
So these champions of low taxes, sometimes, or oftentimes I would actually say, they say that, well, we can have low taxes, but we just have to get rid of government waste, fraud, abuse. There's a lot of pork that we could cut. And we can have low taxes if we just get rid of those types of expenditures. What do you think about that? Is there enough to cut that could actually support low taxes?
Well, I think certainly the goal of cutting government waste, and especially fraud and abuse, and people getting benefits when they aren't entitled to them or according to the law, is a noble one, and it's a very important one, and a lot of politicians certainly push that, and we should do it whenever possible. But I think there are some real limits to that. I'm reminded of a line that the late William Niskanen, who was the longtime president of the Cato Institute, gave. He said, he'd been working in Washington, D.C. for 20 years, and he still hadn't found a single line in any agency budget that was labeled waste, fraud, and abuse. It's there. It's really hard to get it to cut out. And in part because, sometimes there's differences in perspective. What Senator Tom Coburn, who's famous for fighting government pork, or the late Senator William Proxmire for many years gave out his Golden Fleece Award. So some of what they thought was wasteful taxpayer spending were other things that might have been like National Science Foundation grants, which were serving some scientific advancement. When you describe it for the public, maybe out of context, it looks like a real waste of money. So some of the waste could be waste, but there's legitimate debates about whether that's waste or not. And other forms of abuse sort of stem from some problems of, if you have people working for the welfare administration and they feel that people should be entitled to some benefits that they aren't legally allowed to receive, they might be looking to find ways to get people back on the welfare rolls after we had our welfare reform in the 1990s. So, there are a lot of, we can certainly try to cut out waste, fraud, and abuse, and we do it whenever we can, but there are limits to that, and there's always inevitably going to be some. And at some point, you have to pay for these services. There are certainly some limits, and we can't always campaign saying, no, we really don't have to tax you. We can actually cut all the fraud and abuse.
Mm-hmm. When you generalize about government programs, the one common denominator that you always think of is government inefficiency and low quality. Is this somehow a result of the incentive for politicians to spend but not tax enough to support these programs?
I think it is a real danger. I think it probably does arise, because what you can do is reduce the quality of something. You provide something, you provide the facade, or you provide the appearance of providing something good, but it's not as good as good. So you cut back on a lot of different elements of quality. Now in the marketplace, that becomes problematic because people are, if you disappoint consumer expectations, they're going to be less likely to buy your product in the future. And so that can have a real effect. But in the political system, in effect, you could be trying to roll the dice or play the game or assume that somehow people won't be able to discern the decline in quality. So, I think a really good example of this is our Medicaid program, which provides a medical benefits or health insurance for lower income and disabled and some of the elderly Americans. But the program although it eats up a large chunk of state budgets, at the same time, a lot of the reimbursement rates for doctors and hospitals are very low compared to under Medicare or private insurance. And so there are real problems with doctors not being willing to sign up and take on Medicaid patients. And this translates into bad health outcomes for the Medicaid patients. There's studies that show that Medicaid patients are more likely to have complications or even die from various types of surgeries than other patients with other types of insurance, or even the uninsured. And so the cutting back on all the quality does have some very real effects. I think certainly Medicaid is one of the programs where we see that, and I think some of it's sort of inevitable. If you're not really going to collect enough in taxes, but you still want to promise all the benefits, you're going to be led to make some inevitable cost-cutting decisions.
Yeah, and this seems like a particular concern given that government is traditionally providing essential goods and services like healthcare, education, and infrastructure. So this has potentially pretty high cost for the economy, correct?
Yeah, I think it definitely could. So we have public schools, but we all know our K through 12 system in the United States has been underperforming in any kind of international comparisons. It costs a lot, doesn't seem to perform as well as some other nations' school systems, and that's costing our economy because because education is important, infrastructure and highways are important, and if these goods aren't being provided at a high quality, it's going to have some real consequences. We don't have a labor force that's as well trained, and so I think they could end up having some real effects on economic performance that are an inevitable consequence, not necessarily of government. Certainly trying to do a lot of these things on the cheap. And so by trying to cut corners, by trying to, at the one hand, appear like you're providing all of these services, goods and services to people, but at the other hand, not really collecting the money for it, it ends up with an outcome that maybe could be worse than either well-funded government services or privatizing the services and allowing the markets to provide them all together.
It seems like another way that a spend but not tax politician can attempt to survive in the political world while also balancing the budget may be through government fees and other types of fees of that nature for driver's license and things like that. Do you see politicians doing that, and what type of effect does that have?
We've certainly seen a rash of different types of fees of different types that get imposed on people, often through the court system. And I think it's important to start off by making the distinction that there's a real distinction between the types of fees that are imposed on people through the court system and the user fees that we've talked about before. If you want to think about funding state parks through by having entrance fees for the parks, that makes perfect sense because we can choose whether we want to go to the state park. If I decide to go to Blue Springs State Park and to take the family there, we choose whether or not we want to pay that entrance fee. And if it doesn't offer us good value or some type of entertainment value or outdoor recreation value, we can choose not to go there and avoid the fee. If you put fees on people who are coming into involved with the legal system, they're not necessarily, I mean, you might say that you can have some appearance of saying, oh, they chose to break the law, but we have a lot of laws in place and you can get entangled in the legal system and then you end up having to bear a lot of fees. I think, one of the good examples of this, and it also ends up being distasteful, are fees that have been imposed on by various governments across the country to charge people for using public defenders or charge people for actually even being jailed. That you go to jail, you serve your time, and then you get billed for it afterwards. And then you can get fined for not paying your bill, and then you can wind up back in prison. You have in Texas and some other states, they have this something known as a driver responsibility program, which sounds sort of good on the surface, and say like, well, we're going to charge drivers who get in accidents or get tickets for some of the other costs of our highway system, like say your trauma centers, which is what they use the money for in Texas. It's a way to avoid paying, having taxes, and somehow have the appearance of these user fees, but it's very different. And so, you end up with, I think, a real ethical problem here of taking somebody who's been involved, who's come involved with our court system, and then you're lumping all of these fees on it. And at some level, you get to the case of in the famous book Les Miserables, where the punishment way outweighs the punishment levied on Jean Valjean is so out of line with his offense. And I think some people have claimed that this leads to something the modern day equivalent of debtor's prison. That for lower income Americans, when they get into trouble with the legal system, and then they can't pay all of these fees that get on top of it, then they end up going back to jail for not paying the fees. And I think it's quite problematic.
So what's a true advocate of a limited government supposed to do? If they raise taxes to bring them in line with expenditures, they'll be called a liberal. But if they cut spending to bring them in line with the taxes, they'll be referred to as austerian, or cutting budgets to the bone so that people can't get essential government services. What can a politician that is truly concerned about the limited government do in this situation?
Well, I think one thing I mentioned earlier is privatization, and a lot of times when we have the good user fees, the user fees that really do line up with people who are benefiting or using government services, we're on the road to a market basis for providing some of these some of these services or goods through the private sector. And so I think a truly limited, a politician in favor of limited government should look to privatize some of these services when possible, and not, which means that you can no longer take credit for them, but you're going to turn them over to the private sector. So instead of attempting to provide everything, try to scale things back. Another thing that I think we end up having, we can have as a good system in the United States is with our state and local governments. Some state and local governments can provide higher levels of services if that's what their citizens want. And these are some pictures from Minneapolis. And Minneapolis is well known for having a great parks and recreation system. Now, I mean, you have to pay higher taxes to have all of these parks, and there are great parks that offer all kinds of jogging and boating and cross-country skiing opportunities, but you do have to pay for them. Now, if you have a state or local government that's imposing taxes and then providing these services, it can lead to something economists have been calling Tibu competition, where the people who want to have higher levels of government services can choose to live in a jurisdiction where they have to pay higher taxes, but they get higher services. And you can sort of mimic what happens in the marketplace by having then people who choose to have low, don't really want all of these services, they can choose to live in a jurisdiction where they have lower taxes.
So we've primarily been talking about the incentives that state and local politicians face when it comes to spending and taxation. Does the federal government get involved in this at all? Do they encourage, do they discourage this type of behavior?
Well, they certainly end up playing a role, and through all the federal government transfers, the money that comes from the federal government is certainly a big part of this equation. But I think it ends up, the money that comes from the federal government usually has some kind of strings or qualifications. As a state or local government, you have to apply for the grants, the grant money that's available from the federal government. And after the 9/11 attacks, we saw all kinds of grant programs occurring through Homeland Security. And so that was the big thing. And state and local governments were able to pass off a lot of, in effect, pass off some of their costs of their services to the federal government by claiming it was somehow Homeland Security related. But even in that case, there ends up being a mismatch between the types of programs that would best serve the local community and the types of programs that the federal government's willing to pay for right now. So one of the things that happened, the Homeland Security was paying all kinds of money for first responders, but they weren't really paying a lot, giving grants for emergency management. So in a community where maybe they really needed money for their emergency management, they had to get like equipment to deal with a chemical attack, even though that wasn't necessarily, probably necessary. And so that mismatch means that these billions of dollars that are coming from the federal government don't really get spent in a way that provides maximum benefits.
And was this the structure of how the founders actually intended federalism to work in the United States?
I really don't think it is, because fiscal federalism is a great idea for some of the reasons we already talked about, but it also involves local governments being willing to actually, local politicians being willing to step up and pay for the services that they're going to provide. And I think a great example of this comes from if you look at the process that was involved in the adoption of the Common Core curriculum recently by states across the country. What the federal government made available is the money through this Race to the Top program for states that adopted a curriculum that would meet the Common Core criteria. Now, leaving aside the whole question of whether the Common Core is a good idea or bad, it seems like there was this huge rush of states to go ahead and adopt the Common Core because apparently they heard that money was available. And they say, oh, money's available from Washington for this? Well, and all we have to do is adopt the Common Core? That sounds like a great deal. And somehow, that's just not how federalism is supposed to work. We're supposed to have more from our state and local governments for federalism to be a good system. Well, as we've come to the end of our time here, thanks very much, Dan, for coming on and taking on my role for a show and asking the questions.
Thank you very much, Dan.
And thanks for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.